Welcome to No Longer Conformed. I'm Erik Garthe, and we are studying It's About Loving God, Bible studies on the Christian life. In this session, we'll be looking at Mark chapter 6, verses 30 to 34, trusting service. When was the last time you had to do something that you thought was just impossible to do? The more believers grow in their commitment, the better they understand that God can meet all their needs. Never be afraid to trust an unknown future to a known God. That was Corrie ten Boom who said those words. First, Jesus has concern for the needs of his followers. Look at those verses, verse 6 right through verse 34. And then the apostles gathered to Jesus and told him all things, both what they had done and what they had taught. And he said to them, "Come aside by yourselves to a deserted place and rest a while." For there were many coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat. So they departed to a deserted place in the boat by themselves. But the multitudes saw them departing, and many knew him and ran there on foot from all the cities. They arrived before them and came together to him. And Jesus, when he saw them, saw a great multitude and was moved with compassion for them, because they were like sheep not having a shepherd. So he began to teach them many things. He cares about our needs. When the apostles returned from their mission, they met with Jesus and gave him a report of their activities. Jesus had concern for their well-being and invited them to go on a retreat with him. He knew they needed rest and privacy after their tiring ministry expedition and the continuing press of the people. So he said, "Come aside by yourselves to a deserted place and rest a while." Exertion of energy requires refreshment of our whole being. Physical, the strenuous activity expends strength. Physical, mountaintop events result in valleys. Emotional and mental, ministry can be draining. After a week of labor, we need a day of rest and worship. But when they arrived at the retreat site, they were met with many of Jesus' followers who already got there. Jesus had concern for their spiritual conditions. He taught till late in the day. It says he was moved with compassion for them. They were like sheep not having a shepherd, lacking any guidance, exposed to sin, heading to spiritual destruction. They had no teachers of truth. They had no guidance. They had no spiritual food. So Jesus has concern for the needs of his followers, whether it was the closer ones or ones that just kind of came along and were just there to hear everything. Second, Jesus has knowledge of the limits of his servants. Look at verse 35, down to verse 37. When the day was now far spent, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and already the hour is late." He send them away that they may go to the surrounding country and villages and buy themselves bread for they have nothing to eat. But he answered and said to them, "You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "Shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give them something to eat?" He knows our limitations. The disciples saw a problem and proposed a solution. They were in the wilderness and it would get dark soon. Send the people away so they can eat. The Lord saw an opportunity and planned an education. Feed the people right where they are. So class began. Feeding all those people would be expensive, more than they had among their resources. John chapter 6 and verse 5 says, "Then Jesus lifted up his eyes, and seeing a great multitude coming toward him, he said to Philip, 'Where shall we buy bread that these may eat?' But this he said to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may have a little." One of his disciples, Andrew, Peter's brother, said to him, "There's a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish, but what are they among so many?" Listen, just information-wise, a denarius was a day's wages. 200 denarii would have been 8 months' salary. The average person would not have that much money handy, particularly the disciples. And then third, Jesus has power in the provision of his resources. Look at verse 38 down to verse 44. But he said to them, "How many loaves do you have? Go and see." And when they found out, they said 5 and 2 fish. And then he commanded them to make them all sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in ranks, in hundreds and in 50s. And when he had taken the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, blessed and broke the loaves, and gave them to his disciples to set before them. And the 2 fish he divided among them all. So they all ate and were filled. And they took up the 12 baskets full of fragments of the fish. Now those who had eaten the loaves were about 5,000 men. He has power to provide. Jesus took the available food, and the hunger of everyone in the crowd was satisfied. He also provided an extra 12 baskets of bread. What a visual example of Jesus Christ's almighty power. They ate and were filled. 12 baskets full of fragments were taken up. He fed 5,000 men. The Greek word for men is not the generic male referring to mankind. It identified only the men in the crowd. The estimate of 5,000 did not include women and children. With them added, it would have been at least 10, 15,000 people that were fed. With 5 loaves and 2 fish, they had nothing to eat. Jesus took those loaves and fish, blessed them, and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. Jesus' plan, what was it? Use the available resources. He took their offering. Get the people ready for supper. Expectation. Ask the Father to make it sufficient. Pray. And then serve the food in faith. Trust the Lord. There was enough for everyone to eat as much as they desired, and a basket full for each of the 12 apostles after they all were fed. What's the lesson there for us? Jesus prompts us to acknowledge our limited resources. Verse 38. But he said to them, "How many loaves do you have? Go and see." And when they found out, they said 5 and 2 fish. So they acknowledged their limited resources. And he calls us to obey him with limited understanding. Verse 39. Then he commanded them to make them all sit down in groups on the green grass, and they sat down in ranks, in hundreds and 50s. And when he had taken the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, blessed and broke the loaves, and gave them to his disciples to set before them, and the 2 fish he divided among them all. limited understanding, but obey anyway in that limited understanding. And then he causes us to witness his unlimited provision. Our limited resources, his unlimited provision. Verse 42, so they all ate and were filled, and they took up 12 baskets full of fragments of the fish. Now those who had eaten the loaves were about 5,000 men. God wants you to look beyond your physical circumstances and trust him. And he wants you to get beyond yourself and walk in faith. What impossible situation are you now facing? What do you need to give over to the Lord? Think about all that. And have a great day.